The heavy, imported mahogany doors of Laura, the most exclusive and notoriously expensive five-star restaurant in downtown Boston, seemed to loom over me like the gates of an ancient, unforgiving fortress. The brass handles, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the dreary, relentless rain that had been pouring from the charcoal gray sky all evening. I stood under the sprawling, dark velvet awning, the cold mist clinging to the exposed skin of my shoulders, listening to the rhythmic, splashing hiss of luxury vehicles pulling up to the valet stand. My husband, Julian, was standing 3 feet away from me, angrily typing on his phone. He hadn't held an umbrella for me when we got out of our modest sedan. He hadn't offered his jacket. He was entirely consumed by the frantic need to appease his mother, Beatrice, who had summoned us to this extravagant anniversary dinner. To Julian, Beatrice was not just a mother. She was a deity, a terrifying matriarch who controlled the emotional and financial pulse of his entire existence. To me, she was the architect of 5 years of unadulterated psychological torture. "Could you stop shivering?" Julian snapped, not even looking up from his glowing screen. His voice was a tight, irritated hiss that barely carried over the sound of the rain. "My mother hates it when you look like a drowned rat. Fix your hair, Chloe. You already insisted on wearing that incredibly cheap-looking dress, so the absolute least you can do is stand up straight and try to look like you actually belong in a place like this." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply looked down at my dress. It was a flawless vintage black silk sheath that I had purchased at a private auction in Paris for a sum that eclipsed Julian's annual salary. But because it didn't have a massive, gaudy designer logo plastered across the chest, Julian and his family naturally assumed I had bought it off a clearance rack at a discount department store. That was the narrative they had constructed for me from the very first day we met. I was Chloe, the pathetic, struggling girl with the invisible little data entry job. I was the gold digger who had miraculously tricked their precious son into marriage. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy evening air fill my lungs, and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors. The transition from the freezing, chaotic street to the interior of Laura was like stepping into a different dimension. The air inside was thick and warm, heavily perfumed with the intoxicating rich scents of roasting Wagyu beef, black truffles, and aged oak. Massive, cascading crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring, hand-painted ceilings, casting a warm, buttery golden light over the dining room. The floors were a breathtaking expanse of imported Italian marble, polished to such a high sheen that it looked like dark water. Every table was draped in crisp, blindingly white linen and set with heavy, ornate silver cutlery that gleamed aggressively under the lights. The ambient noise was a hushed, sophisticated symphony of clinking crystal champagne flutes, soft jazz from a live pianist in the corner, and the low, murmuring voices of the city's absolute elite. The maitre d', a tall, incredibly rigid man in a flawless tuxedo, looked me up and down with a practiced, microscopic sneer before his eyes landed on Julian. Instantly, the man's posture shifted into one of deep, sycophantic reverence. "Ah, Mr. Sterling," the maitre d' purred, bowing his head slightly. "Your family is already expecting you in the private alcove. Right this way, please." Julian puffed out his chest, completely energized by the unearned respect, and marched after the man without even glancing back to see if I was following. I trailed behind him, the soft click of my heels completely muffled by the thick, luxurious Persian runner rugs that lined the pathways between the tables. We approached the VIP alcove, a semi-private dining area elevated 2 steps above the main floor and shielded by heavy velvet curtains. Sitting right in the center, reigning over the circular booth like a queen on a throne, was my mother-in-law, Beatrice. She was dripping in offensive amounts of generational wealth. Her neck and wrists were weighed down by cold, heavy diamonds that caught the chandelier light and practically blinded anyone who looked directly at her. Her face, pulled tight by expensive and frequent surgical interventions, was locked into a permanent mask of arrogant dissatisfaction. Sitting to her right was the absolute golden child of the Sterling family, Julian's older brother, Carter. Carter was 34, wore an ostentatious Rolex that was far too large for his wrist, and possessed the kind of loud, suffocating confidence that only mediocre men with massive trust funds truly master. Next to Carter was his wife, Sloane, a woman whose entire personality consisted of designer handbags and deeply ingrained racial and class microaggressions. The moment Julian and I stepped into the alcove, the light conversation instantly died. Beatrice paused, with a crystal champagne flute halfway to her lips. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows arched upward, disappearing into the stiff real estate of her forehead. "Well," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying a theatrical, booming resonance that was deliberately loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Look who finally decided to grace us with their presence. I was beginning to think you couldn't scrape together enough change for the valet parking." Carter let out a loud, braying laugh, slapping his hand against the crisp white tablecloth. Sloane giggled musically, covering her mouth with a hand that sported a blinding 5-carat engagement ring. Julian instantly flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson. He hurried around the table, leaning down to press a desperate, submissive kiss to his mother's cheek. "Traffic was terrible, Mother," Julian stammered, frantically pulling out his chair. "I am so sorry. You know how the downtown gridlock gets in the rain." "Traffic is for people who don't know how to plan ahead, Julian," Beatrice said coldly, dismissing him entirely. Her piercing, predatory gaze snapped to me as I quietly took the only remaining seat at the very edge of the booth, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. "And Chloe, wearing black again, I see. I suppose it's practical. It hides the stains so you don't have to pay for the dry cleaning. Tell me, dear, does that little clerical job of yours not offer any sort of holiday bonus? We could have easily advanced you a few $100s so you wouldn't have to show up to my anniversary dinner looking like you're attending a funeral for a minor acquaintance." I folded my hands perfectly in my lap, keeping my spine absolutely straight. I didn't flinch. I didn't break eye contact. "I like black, Beatrice," I replied, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of the intimidation she so desperately craved. "It's timeless." Sloane leaned across the table, her heavy floral perfume completely overwhelming the delicate scent of the expensive food. "It's just so brave of you to wear something so plain to a place like this," Sloane said, dripping with venomous fake sympathy. "Carter and I were just talking about how hard it must be for you to adapt to this tier of society. I mean, going from punching numbers into a spreadsheet all day to dining at Laura, it must be incredibly overwhelming for your nervous system." "I am managing just fine, Sloane," I said calmly. "Thank you for your overwhelming concern." Julian kicked me sharply under the table. I looked at him, and he was glaring at me with wide, panicked eyes, silently begging me to bow my head and take the abuse so he wouldn't have to deal with the fallout. For the next 2 hours, I sat in agonizing silence and watched a masterclass in pure, unfiltered gluttony. Carter and Beatrice treated the incredibly intimidating menu as if it were a limitless buffet challenge. They didn't just order food, they ordered status. Carter loudly summoned the sommelier, demanding 3 bottles of a highly rare 1998 Bordeaux that cost a staggering $600 each. Beatrice ordered the imported Osetra caviar service, taking 2 tiny bites and pushing the $300 tin away because it wasn't chilled to her exact specifications. They ordered massive, bone-in Wagyu tomahawk steaks, butter-poached lobster tails, and fresh white truffles that the waiter shaved directly onto their plates with trembling hands. I ordered a simple garden salad and a glass of tap water. I knew exactly how this toxic game was played. Every time we went out to eat, Julian's family made a grand public spectacle of forcing Julian to split the bill, deliberately bleeding his bank account dry to remind him that he would never be as wealthy or successful as Carter. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. The cruelty in Beatrice's eyes was sharper. The smirks passing between Carter and Sloane were entirely too coordinated. When the dessert plates were finally cleared away, leaving a chaotic mess of discarded silver forks, half-eaten imported cheeses, and empty crystal wine bottles, the tension in the alcove spiked. The head waiter approached the table, his posture incredibly stiff, carrying a heavy black leather folio containing the final bill. Normally, the waiter would place it directly in the center of the table, but Beatrice raised her hand, snapping her diamond-covered fingers with a sharp, echoing crack. "Bring that to the young woman at the end of the table," Beatrice commanded, pointing her finger directly at my face. The waiter hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between the terrifying matriarch and me. He clearly sensed the hostile family dynamics at play, but a waiter at a five-star restaurant knows better than to argue with a woman wearing that many diamonds. He walked over to my chair, gave me a look of deep, silent apology, and placed the heavy leather folio right next to my glass of tap water. The alcove fell dead silent. The live jazz music in the background seemed to fade away completely. Julian swallowed hard, looking down at his lap, refusing to meet my eyes. I didn't move. I looked at the black leather. Then, I looked up at Beatrice. "What is this, Beatrice?" I asked softly. Beatrice leaned back in her plush, velvet seat, swirling the last sip of her expensive Bordeaux in her glass. A slow, chilling, completely calculated smile spread across her surgically tightened face. "That, Chloe," Beatrice announced, her voice rising in volume so the adjacent tables could witness my public humiliation, "is the bill. And tonight, you are going to pay it." Carter let out a low, mocking whistle, leaning in closer to the table like a spectator at a gladiator match. Sloane giggled, pulling out her compact mirror to check her lipstick, pretending not to watch the execution while soaking in every single second of it. "The total is $3,240, Beatrice continued, enunciating every single syllable as if I were too stupid to comprehend the numbers. "We have carried you for 5 years, Chloe. We have allowed you to attach your thoroughly unremarkable name to the Sterling family legacy. We have tolerated your lack of class, your cheap clothes, and your completely embarrassing low-level secretarial job. But tonight is my anniversary, and I have decided that it is finally time for you to earn your keep." I looked at Julian, my husband, the man who had stood at an altar and promised to protect me. He was staring intensely at his empty dessert plate, his hands trembling slightly where they rested on his knees. He wasn't going to say a word. He was going to let his mother publicly eviscerate me in the middle of a crowded, elite restaurant over a $3,000 bill that he knew I supposedly couldn't afford. "I ordered a side salad and tap water, Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly level. The sheer, terrifying calm in my tone made Sloane pause her lipstick application. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shed a single humiliating tear. "I don't care if you ordered oxygen!" Beatrice snarled, her fake, polite veneer cracking to reveal the vicious, ugly monster underneath. She leaned across the table, her eyes wide and unblinking. "You are an outsider. You are a leech feeding off the success of my sons. Carter is a senior vice president at Vanguard Holdings. Julian is a regional director. They are important men. You are absolutely nothing. You will take out whatever pathetic, high-interest credit card you have in that cheap little purse of yours. and you will pay for this meal, or I will personally make sure the management throws you out into the street like the trash you are." The sheer, unvarnished disrespect. The absolute, staggering audacity of these people sitting there, bloated on expensive wine and Wagyu beef, demanding that I finance their gluttony to prove my worth to a family I despised. It was the final push I needed. For 5 years, I had maintained the perfect disguise. I had played the quiet, submissive wife. I had endured their relentless insults, their passive-aggressive snipes, and their constant, suffocating financial abuse, because I foolishly thought Julian might eventually find a spine. I thought if I just stayed under the radar, the toxicity wouldn't touch my actual peace. But looking at Beatrice's snarling face, and then at Carter's smug, arrogant grin, something massive and irreversible shifted inside my chest. The heavy, burdensome chains of seeking their approval simply evaporated into the warm, truffle-scented air. They had absolutely no idea who they were screaming at. They truly believed they were humiliating a broke, desperate data entry clerk. They had no idea that for the past 6 years, under my maiden name and an impenetrable web of blind corporate trusts, I was the founder and majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings, the exact massive holding company that employed both Carter and Julian. They didn't know that every single dime of the supposed generational wealth Carter constantly bragged about was authorized by my signature. They didn't know I could liquidate their entire reality before the valet even brought their cars around. I didn't yell back. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I let a slow, cold, utterly terrifying smile touched the corners of my mouth. I saw the flash of genuine confusion register in Beatrice's eyes. She expected panic. She expected me to break down in humiliating sobs and beg Julian to save me. My absolute silence unsettled her more than a scream ever could. I reached into my small vintage silk clutch. I didn't pull out a credit card. I pulled out a crisp, brand new $50 bill. I stood up. The movement was so smooth and deliberate that the chair barely made a sound against the marble floor. I placed the $50 bill directly on top of the black leather folio. "This covers the garden salad, the tap water, and an incredibly generous tip for the waiter who had to endure your abysmal manners this evening," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the sudden silence of the dining room. Beatrice gasped, pressing a diamond-clad hand to her chest. "How dare you!" she screeched, completely losing her mind in front of the entire restaurant. "You cannot walk away from this table! Julian, control your wife right this instant! Tell her to sit down and pay this bill!" Julian finally looked up, his face pale with sheer terror. "Chloe, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just put it on a card. I'll pay you back secretly tomorrow. Just do it so she stops yelling." "No, Julian," I said, looking down at the weak, pathetic man I had wasted 5 years of my life on. "I'm not financing your mother's delusions anymore. And you aren't paying me back tomorrow, because as of tonight, I'm freezing every single joint account we have." I turned my back on them. I didn't look over my shoulder as Carter began shouting empty threats or as Beatrice shrieked for the manager to call the police on me. I walked down the 2 steps from the alcove, my spine perfectly straight, moving through the hushed, staring crowd of Boston's elite with the grace of an apex predator leaving a cage. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the freezing rain. The valet rushed forward, asking for my ticket, but I waved him off. I didn't need the modest sedan. I walked around the corner, out of sight of the restaurant's grand entrance, and tapped a single button on my phone. A massive, custom black Maybach Pullman instantly pulled out of an underground garage across the street, its tires hissing against the wet pavement, and stopped directly in front of me. My private driver, a former military contractor, stepped out into the pouring rain without an umbrella and opened the heavy armored rear door for me. I slid into the heated, pristine leather interior. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. I pulled my secondary encrypted smartphone from my clutch, the phone Julian and his family didn't even know existed. I dialed the private 24-hour emergency number for my chief operating officer. He answered on the first ring. "Evelyn." His sharp professional voice came through the speaker. "What do you need?" "Marcus," I said, staring out the tinted windows at the glowing lights of the restaurant where my soon-to-be ex-husband and his toxic family were currently arguing with the management over a $3,000 bill. "I need you to pull the employment files for Carter Sterling and Julian Sterling. Terminate Carter's position immediately with extreme prejudice. Revoke all of his stock options. And as for Julian, freeze his corporate accounts and prepare the Vanguard legal team for an aggressive, scorched earth divorce." The era of playing the pathetic, useless secretary was officially over. The true nightmare for the Sterling family had just begun. The scene abruptly pauses. The chaotic, blurred neon lights of downtown Boston, reflecting off the rain-slicked windows of the Maybach, freeze in absolute stillness. The rhythmic hum of the massive engine goes completely silent. Inside the darkened, luxurious cabin, Chloe slowly turns her head away from the window. She looks directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall. Her expression is no longer the stoic, hardened mask she wore in the restaurant. It is piercing, intimate, and deeply understanding. The ambient sound fades into a low, resonant, cinematic bass tone. Let's pause right here for a second. If you are watching this video right now, I know exactly what your heart is doing. I know you can feel that sharp, electric spike of adrenaline flooding your chest. You recognize that incredibly specific, suffocating tightness in your throat because you have been exactly where I was sitting in that restaurant. You know what it feels like to be the designated punching bag for a family that operates more like a toxic cult than a support system. You know the profound, isolated agony of sitting at a beautifully set table, surrounded by expensive food and supposedly civilized people, while enduring a highly calculated psychological execution. Before we go any further, before I show you exactly how I systematically dismantled the Sterling family's entire empire and reduced my arrogant mother-in-law to an absolute, unrecognizable shell of a woman, I need to talk to you directly. I need to talk about the deeply ingrained, completely poisonous lie that society forces down our throats from the moment we are old enough to understand the concept of family. We are taught relentlessly that we must keep the peace. We are conditioned to believe that when it comes to family, especially in-laws, we must simply swallow our pride, bow our heads, and be the bigger person. We are told that blood, or in my case, a marriage certificate, is an unconditional contract that demands infinite patience, infinite forgiveness, and infinite suffering. We are expected to act as the emotional shock absorbers for their deeply rooted generational trauma, their grotesque narcissism, and their absolute lack of basic human empathy. But let me tell you the absolute, unvarnished truth about being the bigger person in a room full of emotional predators. Being the bigger person is nothing more than a convenient, manipulative script written by abusers to ensure their victims never fight back. It is a leash they wrap around your neck to keep you sitting quietly in your chair while they publicly eviscerate your character, your background, and your absolute worth as a human being. They don't want you to be the bigger person because it's noble. They want you to be the bigger person so they don't have to face the terrifying consequences of their own actions. Think about Beatrice. Think about the sheer, staggering audacity of a woman who sits dripping in diamonds, ordering $600 bottles of wine she barely drinks, only to weaponize a $3,000 bill against a woman she genuinely believes is living paycheck to paycheck. This was never about the money for Beatrice. To her, $3,000 is the equivalent of spare change lost in the cushions of her imported sofa. This was about power. This was a public execution. This was a deliberate, highly orchestrated test of dominance, meant to prove to her golden child son, her weak-willed other son, and the entire elite society of Boston that she owned me. That she could crush me beneath the heel of her designer shoes, and I would actually thank her for the privilege. And then there is Julian, my husband. The man who stood at an altar, looked me in the eyes and promised before God and our friends to protect me, to honor me, and to stand by my side against the world. If you have ever been in a relationship with a Julian, you know that the enabler is often far more dangerous than the primary abuser. The abuser stabs you in the chest, right where you can see it coming. The enabler stands behind you, holds your arms down, and whispers in your ear that you are overreacting while the blade goes in. Julian's absolute silence at that table, his pathetic, terrified gaze fixed on his empty dessert plate, his frantic whispers begging me to just pull out a credit card and finance his mother's delusion so he wouldn't have to face her wrath, was the ultimate betrayal. He was perfectly willing to let me be financially and emotionally destroyed just to buy himself another day of false peace in his mother's kingdom. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a human shield. For 5 years, I played the part perfectly. I played the quiet, unimpressive, lower-class secretary. I endured the relentless, microscopic snipes about my cheap clothes, my pedestrian taste, and my unremarkable family background. I absorbed the toxic, passive-aggressive comments from Sloane, a woman whose entire existence is funded by the very company she didn't know I owned. I allowed Carter to flaunt his mid-level corporate success in my face, completely ignorant of the fact that I was the phantom architect of his entire career trajectory. I endured it because I foolishly believed that love could eventually cure dysfunction. I thought if I just loved Julian enough, if I was just patient enough, he would eventually find his spine. He would eventually stand up, push back from the table, and tell his mother that her reign of terror was over. But sitting in that freezing restaurant, listening to the clinking of crystal and the hushed, arrogant laughter of my abusers, I finally realized the coldest, hardest truth of all. You cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you. You cannot heal a family dynamic that is entirely dependent on your subjugation. And more importantly, you should never, ever apologize for finally realizing your own immense, undeniable power. When I placed that crisp $50 bill on that black leather folio, I wasn't just paying for a garden salad and a glass of tap water. I was buying my absolute, unconditional freedom. I was purchasing the exact moment the Sterling family's perfectly curated, incredibly fragile world began to burn to the ground. They thought they were humiliating a nobody. They thought they had backed a helpless, penniless victim into a corner with no escape. They had absolutely no idea that they had just publicly insulted the sole proprietor of Vanguard Holdings. They had no idea that the pathetic little data entry job they mocked relentlessly was actually a massive, multinational private equity firm that held the deeds to their homes, the keys to their careers, and the literal strings to their entire financial existence. They wanted me to pay the bill? I am going to pay the bill. but the currency I am using is going to bankrupt them in ways they cannot even begin to comprehend. Before we step back into this story, before I show you the absolute chaos that unfolds when the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire decides to stop playing the victim and starts playing the executioner, I want to hear from you. I want to know who is sitting on the other side of this screen. Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family? Have you ever had to sit at a dinner table, a holiday gathering, or a wedding, smiling so hard your jaw aches, while toxic relatives hurl veiled insults at you disguised as jokes? Have you ever had to deal with an overbearing, narcissistic mother-in-law who constantly tried to make you feel like you were never good enough for her son? Have you ever looked at the person you love and realized, with absolute, crushing clarity, that they will never, ever defend you against their own toxic bloodline? If you know exactly what I am talking about, I need you to go down to the comments right now and tell me where you are watching this from. I want to see the cities, the states, and the countries. I want to see the massive, undeniable global army of people who have survived this exact same psychological warfare. Share your story. Tell me about the moment you finally snapped. Tell me about the day you decided to stop financing your family's delusions and started funding your own peace. Your story in the comments might be the exact spark someone else needs to finally pack their bags, freeze the joint accounts, and walk out the door. We are not just telling a story today. We are building an unbreakable community of survivors. We are building a network of people who understand that walking away is not a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate, apex move of self-preservation. If this story is already resonating with you, if you are absolutely ready to watch the Sterling family get legally, financially, and socially annihilated for what they tried to do to me, hit that like button right now. Smash the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss a single second of this absolute masterclass in revenge. We are done being the bigger person. We are done keeping the peace. From this moment on, we are holding them entirely accountable. Are you ready to see what happens when the tow trucks arrive? The stock options are completely wiped out, and Beatrice finally realizes she just declared war on a billionaire? Let's get back to the story. The heavy, soundproofed doors of the Maybach sealed shut, instantly severing me from the chaotic, rain-soaked streets of downtown Boston. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. A stark, profound contrast to the screeching, desperate demands my mother-in-law, Beatrice, was undoubtedly making inside that restaurant. The ambient lighting of the car cast a soft, icy blue glow over the pristine, hand-stitched leather. I leaned my head back against the plush headrest, closing my eyes as the massive engine roared to life with a barely perceptible hum. As the car glided effortlessly through the slick, neon-lit streets, the adrenaline that had spiked in my blood during that confrontation began to recede, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. To truly understand the absolute, unyielding magnitude of the vengeance I had just set into motion, you have to understand the deeply rotting, putrid foundation of the Sterling family empire. You have to understand the meticulously crafted illusion I had been trapped inside for 5 agonizing years. The Sterlings were the epitome of a very specific, deeply pathetic breed of high society. The old money destitute. To the outside world, and certainly to anyone who glanced at their carefully curated social media profiles, the Sterlings were untouchable royalty. Beatrice lived in a sprawling, historical, 6-bedroom Tudor estate on the prestigious North Shore. The driveway was lined with century-old weeping willows. The foyer boasted imported Italian marble, and heavy oak doors guarded rooms filled with antique mahogany furniture and crystal chandeliers. But it was all a stage set. a crumbling, desperate facade masking a terrifying financial reality. Julian's father, Richard Sterling, had been a man who possessed a legendary appetite for luxury and absolutely zero talent for business. When he died of a sudden heart attack 12 years ago, he left behind a labyrinth of heavily leveraged assets, secret second mortgages, and a mountain of suffocating debt. He left the family with the look of extreme wealth, but completely stripped them of the actual capital required to maintain it. Instead of downsizing, instead of accepting reality and adjusting their lifestyle, Beatrice doubled down on the delusion. She became a tyrant of optics. She viewed her two sons not as human beings, but as financial instruments whose sole purpose was to restore the sterling treasury and keep her dripping in diamonds. And in Beatrice's warped, narcissistic mind, there was a clear, undeniable hierarchy. Carter, the eldest, was the golden child. He was the supposed heir apparent, the savior of the family name. Carter was tall, possessed the sharp jawline of a country club tennis pro, and oozed the kind of loud, unearned confidence that society tragically often mistakes for competence. From the moment he could walk, Beatrice had worshipped him with a cloying, suffocating devotion. He was sent to elite boarding schools where he barely scraped by with C- averages, his tuition paid for by liquidating the last of the family's performing stocks. When he crashed his brand-new, leased Porsche into a retaining wall at 19 while driving under the influence, Beatrice didn't reprimand him. She bribed the local police chief, blamed the poorly lit roads, and bought him a faster, more expensive car the very next week. Carter was aggressively mediocre. He possessed no work ethic, no original thoughts, and absolutely zero resilience. He was a man made entirely of tailored Italian wool and inherited arrogance. Yet, to hear Beatrice tell it, Carter was a titan of industry. When he managed to secure a mid-level management position at Vanguard Holdings, a job he only got because Beatrice relentlessly harassed an old family friend who sat on the hiring committee, she threw a catered dinner party for 50 people, toasting him as if he had just conquered a small nation. Carter played the part of the wealthy playboy perfectly. He married Sloane, a woman whose father owned a moderately successful chain of car dealerships, entirely because she possessed the right look and a trust fund that could temporarily float Carter's crippling gambling debts and his obsession with buying depreciating luxury watches. Together, they were the glittering, superficial crown jewels of Beatrice's crumbling kingdom. And then there was Julian. If Carter was the golden child, Julian was the designated shock absorber. Julian was the younger, softer, far more anxious brother who had spent his entire life desperately scrambling for the microscopic crumbs of affection his mother occasionally let fall from Carter's table. When I first met Julian, he was wearing a very convincing mask. We met at a quiet, unpretentious coffee shop near the financial district. He seemed kind, attentive, and remarkably grounded for someone who grew up on the North Shore. He told me he was trying to make his own way, to step out of his family's shadow. I fell in love with his vulnerability. I fell in love with the man he was pretending to be. But the mask slipped the absolute second he slipped a ring onto my finger. I quickly realized that Julian didn't want to step out of his family's shadow. He wanted to pull me into the darkness with him. He needed a wife who would act as a buffer between him and his mother's relentless, crushing disappointment. He needed a human shield. The very first time Julian brought me to the Sterling estate for Thanksgiving, the battle lines were permanently drawn. I had worn a simple, elegant navy dress. I brought a bottle of wine that I thought was reasonably nice. The moment the heavy oak front door swung open, Beatrice stood in the foyer, illuminated by the massive crystal chandelier above her, wearing a silk evening gown and a pearl necklace that looked like it weighed 5 pounds. She took one look at my dress, looked down at the bottle of wine, and let out a soft, pitying sigh. "Julian, darling," Beatrice had said, her voice echoing off the cold marble walls. "You didn't tell me your little friend was coming straight from her shift at well, wherever it is she works. We would have set a more casual table." Julian hadn't defended me. He just nervously laughed, his eyes darting to the floor, and apologized to his mother for my lack of foresight. From that day forward, my role in the Sterling family was permanently codified. I was the peasant. I was the charity case. I was the tragically uncultured, aggressively ordinary girl with the little data entry job who had managed to trap their precious, naive son. The psychological warfare was relentless, subtle, and incredibly cruel. At family dinners, Beatrice would loudly offer to give me Sloane's discarded designer clothing, suggesting that it might help me look more presentable at my office. Carter would make a grand spectacle of pulling out his Platinum American Express card to pay for exorbitant bar tabs, looking directly at me and saying, "Don't worry, Chloe. I know this place is a little out of your tax bracket. The adults have it covered." Sloane would corner me in the kitchen, her voice dripping with fake, sugary concern, asking how I managed to survive on a secretarial salary, and whether Julian was embarrassed that he had to be the sole breadwinner of our household. And Julian let it happen. Every single time. In fact, he enabled it. Because behind closed doors, Julian was terrified of the family debt. He knew that Carter's lifestyle was a house of cards. He knew that Beatrice's mortgage was secretly months in arrears. And so, the family developed a sickening, parasitic strategy. They would use my supposed poverty as a smokescreen to bleed us dry. Julian would constantly beg me to cover our mortgage, our utilities, and our groceries from my own modest accounts, claiming he needed to invest his salary into Carter's vague business ventures to keep the family afloat. When Beatrice suddenly needed a new transmission for her leased Mercedes, it was Julian who secretly drained our joint savings account to pay for it, leaving me to scramble to cover the electric bill. They mocked me for being poor, while secretly relying on my quiet, relentless work ethic to subsidize their fake aristocratic lifestyle. They thought I was a spineless, compliant workhorse, too intimidated by their grand mansion and their country club memberships to ever question the arrangement. They believed their own illusions so completely that they never once stopped to actually look at me. They never once bothered to ask exactly what I was typing into those spreadsheets during my late nights at the home office. They never asked why my little data entry job required me to take international calls at 3 a.m., or why I traveled to Geneva, London, and Tokyo on clerical errands. If they had paid even a fraction of an ounce of attention to me, they would have noticed that the cheap, unbranded black dresses I wore were custom-tailored in Milan. They would have noticed that the modest sedan I drove was simply a decoy to keep them from realizing I owned a fleet of armored vehicles. Because while Carter was busy spending his afternoons playing golf and drinking scotch on the company dime, and while Julian was busy hyperventilating over his mother's approval, I was quietly, ruthlessly, building an empire. 7 years ago, using a small inheritance from my late grandfather, a humble man who taught me the value of compound interest and absolute silence, I started a boutique private equity firm. I didn't care about flashy offices or press releases. I cared about raw, unmitigated leverage. I worked 20-hour days. I identified bloated, dying companies, stripped them down, and sold the viable assets for massive profits. I operated entirely behind a labyrinth of blind trusts and proxy boards. 3 years into my marriage with Julian, my firm, operating under a shell corporation, executed a hostile takeover of a massive, struggling logistics and management firm in Boston. That firm was Vanguard Holdings. I will never forget the surreal, intoxicating power of sitting in my ultra-modern, glass-walled penthouse office overlooking the Boston Harbor, sipping a perfectly brewed espresso, and reading the employee roster of the company I had just purchased for $850 million in cash. There, on page 42, listed as a senior vice president of regional sales, was Carter Sterling. And on page 87, listed as a mid-level regional director, was my husband, Julian Sterling. I held their literal destinies in the palm of my hand. With a single stroke of my Mont Blanc pen, I could have fired them both. I could have walked into the Vanguard boardroom, revealed my true identity, and watched Carter's arrogant, smug face melt into a puddle of absolute terror. But I didn't. True revenge, the kind that burns the flesh from the bone and leaves nothing but ashes, requires patience. It requires letting the enemy dig their own grave so deeply that when the dirt finally caves in, no one can hear them scream. So I maintained the disguise. I continued to play the quiet, pathetic little wife. I sat at their extravagant dinners and let them hurl their insults at me. I let Beatrice mock my clothes. I let Carter brag about his massive, completely unearned, six-figure salary. A salary that was quite literally being paid from my personal treasury. I let Julian drain our joint accounts to fund his mother's delusions, knowing that for every dollar he stole, my offshore accounts were generating millions in interest. I used my position as the shadow CEO of Vanguard to secretly monitor Carter's performance. It was a masterclass in sheer incompetence. He lost major client accounts due to his abrasive personality. He routinely approved disastrous logistics contracts because he didn't bother to read the fine print. His department was a black hole of financial loss. Any other CEO would have terminated him immediately. But I instructed my proxy board to keep him on. I instructed them to give him enough rope to hang himself. I even authorized a slight increase in his corporate expense account, watching with dark, venomous amusement as he used my money to buy Sloan more ridiculous handbags to flaunt in my face. I was waiting for the perfect moment. I was waiting for the exact second when their arrogance eclipsed their fragile reality. I was waiting for them to push me so far, to disrespect me so publicly and so unforgivably, that when I finally dropped the hammer, they wouldn't just lose their jobs. They would lose their entire psychological foundation. Tonight, in the VIP alcove of Laura, Beatrice had finally crossed that line. Demanding that I pay a $3,000 bill to prove my worth wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of absolute war. It was the culmination of 5 years of emotional subjugation. She had looked at the titan who silently funded her son's fake life and demanded that I bow to her. As the Maybach glided to a smooth halt in front of the private, secure gates of my hidden downtown penthouse, a residence Julian had absolutely no idea existed, I looked down at the encrypted phone in my hand. A single message glowed brightly against the dark screen. It was from Marcus, my chief operating officer. Execution complete. Carter Sterling's access codes revoked. Security is currently escorting him from the Vanguard premises. Julian Sterling's corporate accounts frozen. The traps are set, boss. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying expression that had absolutely nothing in common with the meek, quiet woman who had entered that restaurant 2 hours ago. The stage was completely set. The golden child was about to discover he was utterly penniless. The weak husband was about to realize he had betrayed a billionaire, and the wicked matriarch was about to watch her fake, crumbling empire shatter against the unbreakable wall of my reality. The morning after the incident at Laura broke crisp, clear, and blindingly bright. The relentless, gloomy rain of the previous night had completely washed away, leaving the Boston skyline sparkling under a brilliant, unforgiving sun. It felt like the universe itself had thoroughly cleansed the stage, preparing the environment for the absolute, unmitigated destruction I was about to unleash. I stood in the center of my master closet, a sprawling, climate-controlled space clad in dark oak and brushed brass that was larger than Julian and I's entire supposed starter home. For 5 years, I had deliberately dressed myself down. I had meticulously curated a wardrobe of unbranded, aggressively plain clothing to maintain the illusion of the pathetic, struggling secretary. I had spent half a decade shrinking myself, dimming my own light, so the fragile, mediocre men in the Sterling family could feel tall. That era officially ended at exactly 8 a.m. I reached past the decoy clothes and pulled out a bespoke, razor-sharp, snow-white Tom Ford power suit. It was a garment constructed for absolute dominance. I paired it with a pair of blood-red, patent-leather Christian Louboutin stilettos that echoed with a terrifying, rhythmic crack against the imported hardwood floors of my penthouse. I swept my hair back into a flawless, severe chignon. I didn't apply the soft, accommodating makeup Julian always preferred. I applied the sharp, striking contour of a woman who was preparing to preside over an execution. I looked at myself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The timid, apologetic girl who had tolerated Beatrice's abuse was gone. Staring back at me was the ruthless, untouchable apex predator of Vanguard Holdings. My private elevator deposited me directly into the secure, subterranean parking garage, where my driver was already standing at attention beside the armored Maybach. "Good morning, Miss Sterling," he said, opening the heavy door. "It's an excellent morning, David," I replied, sliding into the pristine leather interior. "Take me to Vanguard, and inform Marcus to prepare the executive suite. Our guests should be arriving shortly." The Vanguard Holdings headquarters is a towering 60-story monolith of dark, reflective glass and steel, situated right in the beating heart of the financial district. It is a fortress of modern capitalism. The ground floor lobby is a vast, intimidating expanse of white Carrara marble, soaring 40-foot ceilings, and a massive, horseshoe-shaped security desk manned by a team of highly trained, former military personnel. At exactly 8:45 a.m., the chaotic reality of my actions the night before violently collided with the Sterling family's delusion. I watched the entire scene unfold in real time from the massive wall-to-wall high-definition security monitors in my top-floor executive office. I sat behind my desk, a sprawling slab of polished obsidian, sipping a perfectly extracted shot of espresso, watching the monitors like a general surveying a battlefield. Carter was the first to arrive. He sauntered through the revolving glass doors holding a massive iced coffee, wearing a tailored navy suit and his oversized Rolex, looking every bit the arrogant, untouchable senior vice president he pretended to be. He walked with that infuriating, unearned swagger, bypassing the visitor line and heading straight for the VIP executive turnstiles. He confidently slapped his keycard against the scanner. Instead of the usual soft, welcoming green chime, the scanner let out a harsh, aggressive red beep. The heavy glass barricades did not open. Carter frowned. He wiped the card on his jacket and slapped it against the scanner again. Beep. On the monitor, I watched his face flush with annoyance. He sighed dramatically, loudly complaining to the people around him, and marched over to the main security desk. "Hey, my card is malfunctioning," Carter snapped at the head security guard, a massive, unsmiling man named Reynolds. "Fix it! I have a 9 a.m. conference call with the logistics team, and I don't have time to stand around here with the entry-level grunts." Reynolds didn't even blink. He looked down at his terminal, typed in Carter's name, and then looked back up, his face an impenetrable mask of professional indifference. "Your card is not malfunctioning, Mr. Sterling," Reynolds said, his deep voice carrying across the quiet, echoing marble lobby. "Your employment status was officially terminated at 11:42 p.m. last night. Your access privileges to this building have been permanently revoked. Carter froze. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, replaced by a look of profound, stuttering confusion. Excuse me? Terminated? Do you have any idea who I am? I am a senior vice president. I practically run the regional division. Call HR right now. Somebody made a massive clerical error, and when I find out who it is, I am having them fired. Before Reynolds could respond, the heavy glass revolving doors spun again, and Julian rushed into the lobby. He looked absolutely frantic. His hair was disheveled, his tie was crooked, and he was sweating profusely despite the cool morning air. "Carter!" Julian shouted, jogging over to his brother. "Carter, thank God! Something is completely wrong. My corporate credit card was declined at the parking garage, and when I tried to log into our joint checking account to transfer funds, the bank said the account was frozen. Chloe isn't answering her phone. Have you talked to Mom? The restaurant called the police last night when I couldn't pay the bill." Carter stared at Julian, his jaw practically unhinged. "You couldn't pay the bill? What are you talking about? Julian, security is telling me I've been fired." The absolute, unadulterated panic in their eyes was intoxicating to watch. For 5 years, they had operated under the delusion that their status, their wealth, and their comfort were guaranteed by divine right. Watching the foundation of their fake reality crumble in the lobby of my building was better than any symphony. But the true masterpiece was yet to arrive. At 9:05 a.m., a sleek, leased black Mercedes SUV practically jumped the curb outside the building. The driver's side door flew open, and Beatrice stormed out, followed closely by a deeply panicked Sloane. Beatrice was in full battle armor, massive sunglasses, a heavy designer trench coat, and her signature, suffocating air of aristocratic rage. She marched through the revolving doors like she owned the very air inside the building. "Where is the facility manager?" Beatrice shrieked the absolute second her designer heels hit the marble floor. Her voice cut through the quiet, sophisticated hum of the lobby like a chainsaw. "I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this circus right this instant." Carter and Julian rushed over to her, looking like terrified children seeking shelter behind their mother's skirts. "Mom, thank God you're here," Carter stammered. "They locked me out. They're saying I'm terminated." "Nonsense!" Beatrice barked, adjusting her massive diamond rings. "It is a computer glitch. Your father played golf with the original founder of Vanguard. I am not having my son humiliated by some malfunctioning database. I will speak to the CEO personally and have this sorted out. And then I am going to have this entire security staff fired for gross incompetence." Beatrice marched directly up to Reynolds at the security desk. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand flat against the counter. "Listen to me very carefully, you glorified mall cop," Beatrice snarled, her voice echoing off the 40-foot ceilings. "My son is Carter Sterling. You will reactivate his keycard right now, or I will personally ensure that you never work in corporate security in this city again. Now tell me exactly what floor the CEO's office is on." "Up in my penthouse suite." I pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Reynolds," I said smoothly, my voice feeding directly into the earpiece of the head of security. "Send them up. All 4 of them. Use the private executive elevator." On the monitor, I saw Reynolds pause, touch his earpiece, and give a subtle nod. He looked down at Beatrice. "Ma'am," Reynolds said calmly, "the CEO has been expecting you. Please follow me." Beatrice let out a loud, triumphant huff, turning to look at Carter and Julian with a smug, vindicated smirk. "You see," she declared, "this is how you handle things. You don't cower. You demand respect, and the world bends to your will. Come along, boys. Let's go meet this CEO and get your jobs back." They followed Reynolds across the lobby to the private frosted glass elevator reserved exclusively for the C-suite. The doors slid shut, sealing them inside the soundproof, high-speed cabin. I stood up from my obsidian desk. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston Harbor, clasping my hands behind my back. I did not sit in my chair. I wanted to be the very first thing they saw when the doors opened. The private elevator did not stop at the reception area. It opened directly into my office. With a soft hydraulic hiss, the brushed steel doors parted. The Sterling family stepped out onto the plush, acoustic-dampening carpet of the most powerful room in the building. For a fraction of a second, they were completely distracted by the sheer, staggering opulence of the space. The office was larger than Beatrice's entire first floor. It featured a private gallery of original modern art, a massive custom-built wet bar, and a sweeping panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean that cost millions of dollars to secure. "Now this," Beatrice announced, completely oblivious to my presence by the window, "is an office suited for someone of our caliber. Carter, when you negotiate your reinstatement, you need to demand a corner suite like this." "It really is breathtaking," Sloane whispered, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. I slowly turned around. The sunlight caught the pristine white fabric of my Tom Ford suit and the sharp, unforgiving angle of my cheekbones. I looked directly at the four of them, my expression completely void of emotion. "I'm glad you approve of the decor, Beatrice," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the absolute, pin-drop silence of the soundproofed office, it commanded the space like a thunderclap. "I had the marble imported from the same quarry in Italy that you are currently 3 months behind on paying your second mortgage for." The reaction was instantaneous and violently physical. Julian let out a sharp, terrified gasp, taking a stumbling step backward until his back hit the cold steel of the elevator doors. Carter's mouth dropped open, his eyes bulging out of his head as if he were looking at a ghost. Sloane let out a tiny, high-pitched squeak, bringing both hands up to cover her mouth. But Beatrice simply short-circuited. Her surgically tightened face twitched. Her eyes darted frantically around the massive office, looking for the real CEO, completely unable to process the data her brain was receiving. "Chloe?" Beatrice stammered, her voice stripped of all its commanding, aristocratic bass. It sounded weak, pathetic. What are you doing in here? Where is the CEO? Did you break into this office?" I walked slowly across the room, the sharp crack, crack, crack of my Louboutins echoing off the obsidian desk. I didn't stop until I was standing exactly 3 feet away from her. I looked down at her. Without the dim, romantic lighting of a 5-star restaurant to hide her flaws, Beatrice suddenly looked incredibly old, incredibly tired, and incredibly small. "There is no one else coming, Beatrice," I said softly, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "There is no mystery executive for you to charm. There is no old family friend to save you. I bought Vanguard Holdings 3 years ago in an all-cash buyout through a blind trust. I am the sole founder, the majority shareholder, and the chief executive officer. You are standing in my office." The silence in the room was so heavy it felt like the air pressure had dropped. "No," Carter breathed, stepping forward, his face pale with sheer panic. "No, that's literally impossible. You're a data entry clerk. You make $40,000 a year. Julian told us you were drowning in credit card debt." I turned my gaze to my pathetic, trembling husband. Julian looked like he was about to vomit. "Julian told you what he needed to tell you to protect his incredibly fragile ego," I said smoothly, walking behind my massive desk. "Julian needed you to believe I was poor, so you wouldn't ask questions when he secretly drained our joint accounts to fund your pathetic, fake-rich lifestyle." I reached onto the polished surface of my desk and picked up a thick, leather-bound folder. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table in the center of the room. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "Let's drop the illusion, shall we?" I commanded, leaning forward and resting my knuckles on the desk. "Let's talk about the Sterling family legacy you are all so desperately proud of." I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Carter. "Carter, you are not a business prodigy. You are a massive, walking liability. In the past 12 months, your division has hemorrhaged $4.2 million due to your catastrophic mismanagement and your complete inability to read a basic logistics contract. The only reason you were not fired 2 years ago is because I personally instructed HR to keep you on the payroll. I wanted to see exactly how much of a failure you truly were. As of last night, your employment is terminated. Your stock options are completely voided due to a gross negligence clause in your contract. You are leaving this building with absolutely nothing." Carter stumbled back, grabbing the back of a leather chair to keep his knees from buckling. Sloane looked at him, her eyes wide with a sudden dawning horror, as she realized her personal ATM had just been permanently disconnected. I shifted my gaze to my mother-in-law. "And you, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming colder than ice. "You sat at that restaurant last night, dripping in diamonds you can't afford, and demanded that I pay a $3,000 bill to prove I was worthy of your family. You called me a leech. You said I was bleeding your sons dry." I tapped a button on my desk console. The massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall behind me flickered to life. It displayed a highly detailed, deeply confidential financial spreadsheet. "That," I said, pointing at the screen, "is the true Sterling family portfolio. Notice the red ink, Beatrice. Notice how your historic, sprawling Tudor estate on the North Shore has a massive, predatory second mortgage on it? A mortgage that you took out to pay for Carter's ridiculous wedding, and that you have defaulted on for the past 4 consecutive months?" Beatrice swayed on her feet, her face drained of all color, turning a sickening shade of ash gray. How did you get those files?" she whispered, her voice trembling violently. "That is private banking information." I smiled. It was the same cold, terrifying smile I had given her in the restaurant, but magnified 1,000 times by the power of my environment. "It's not private anymore, Beatrice," I told her, relishing every single syllable. "Because 3 weeks ago, my private equity firm bought the distressed debt portfolio from your lender. I own the mortgage on your house. I own the deed. I own the ground you sleep on." I walked out from behind the desk, stepping right into the middle of their shattered reality. I did not yell. I did not scream. I did not need to. The truth was an absolute, devastating weapon, and I was wielding it with surgical precision. "You spent 5 years trying to make me feel completely worthless," I said, looking at each of their terrified, broken faces. "You treated me like a peasant because you needed someone to look down on to distract yourselves from the fact that you are fundamentally broke, entirely incompetent, and completely morally bankrupt." I stopped right in front of Julian. He was weeping. Actual, silent tears were streaming down his face as he realized the absolute magnitude of what he had thrown away. The woman he had allowed his family to emotionally abuse was a billionaire, and he had permanently lost her. "Julian," I said softly, my tone completely void of the love I once held for him. "The divorce papers are in that folder on the table. My legal team is executing an ironclad prenuptial agreement that you foolishly signed 5 years ago because you thought you needed to protect your assets from me. You are getting absolutely nothing. I froze your accounts because the money in them was legally mine. You will pack your bags and be out of the house by noon today." I turned back to the rest of the room. The power flip was absolute. The dynamic had shifted so violently that the psychological whiplash was practically visible in the air. "Now," I said, my voice echoing with total, unapologetic authority. "Security is waiting downstairs to escort you off my property. If any of you ever attempt to contact me again, if you ever step foot near my home, or if you attempt to launch any sort of pathetic legal retaliation, I will liquidate your remaining assets, foreclose on that house by Friday, and leave you entirely bankrupt in the public square." I turned my back on them and walked back to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the harbor, absolutely radiating power. "Get out of my office," I commanded, without looking back. The descent from the 60-story executive penthouse to the ground floor lobby of Vanguard Holdings takes exactly 42 seconds in the high-speed private elevator. For the Sterling family, those 42 seconds must have felt like a terrifying, suffocating plunge into the deepest trenches of hell. I did not follow them down. I didn't need to. I had full audio and visual feeds from the high-definition security cameras seamlessly integrated into the lobby's architecture, streaming directly to the massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall of my office. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the wet bar, walked back over to my obsidian desk, and watched the absolute, unmitigated destruction of my abusers unfold in glorious 4K resolution. When the frosted glass doors of the elevator finally parted on the ground floor, the Sterling family did not stride out with the arrogant, untouchable swagger they had possessed just 20 minutes prior. They stumbled out. They looked physically diminished, as if the sheer gravity of my reality had literally crushed their spines. Reynolds, my imposing head of security, was waiting for them along with 4 other heavily built security contractors dressed in flawless, unmarked black suits. This was not a polite escort. This was a highly visible, highly orchestrated perp walk designed for maximum psychological impact. "Right this way," Reynolds commanded, his deep voice carrying absolutely zero sympathy. He did not gesture toward the private, discreet VIP exit. He pointed a massive, unyielding finger directly toward the center of the main lobby. It was 9:30 a.m. The Vanguard Holdings lobby was operating at peak capacity. Hundreds of employees, analysts, junior executives, logisticians, and support staff were crisscrossing the vast expanse of white Carrara marble, holding coffees and chattering about the morning's market trends. And then a hush fell over the room. It started near the security desk and rippled outward like a wave until the entire sprawling ground floor went completely, deathly silent. Everyone stopped to watch the absolute spectacle unfolding before them. Carter, the supposedly brilliant, untouchable senior vice president, was being flanked by 2 security guards who looked like linebackers. His face was a sickly pale shade of green, sweat beading on his forehead as he desperately tried to avoid eye contact with the dozens of mid-level managers he had bullied and belittled over the past 3 years. He tried to puff out his chest, to salvage some microscopic shred of his alpha male facade, but his hands were shaking so violently that he had to shove them deep into the pockets of his tailored navy suit. Julian trailed behind his brother, openly weeping. His shoulders were slumped, his chest heaving with deep, pathetic, ragged sobs. Several female employees in the lobby, women Julian had constantly bragged to about his wealthy, connected family, covered their mouths in sheer, stunned disbelief as they watched their regional director absolutely disintegrate in public. But the true centerpiece of the humiliation was Beatrice, the woman who had built her entire identity on the illusion of aristocratic superiority was hyperventilating. She was clutching her heavy fake pearls so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She looked frantically around the lobby, her eyes wide and bloodshot, desperate to find a single sympathetic face among the crowd. But there was no sympathy. There was only the cold, unblinking stares of a corporate army watching a tyrant get dragged to the guillotine. As they neared the revolving glass doors, Carter suddenly broke away from the guards. He wasn't trying to escape. He was acting on sheer, desperate instinct. He lunged toward the VIP parking garage entrance off the side of the lobby. "My car!" Carter shouted, his voice cracking hysterically. "I need my car! The keys are in my office!" Reynolds stepped effortlessly into Carter's path, planting his massive frame like a brick wall. "Your office is currently being packed into cardboard boxes by my staff, Mr. Sterling," Reynolds stated loudly, his voice echoing off the 40-foot ceiling so everyone in the lobby could hear. "As for your vehicle, a 2024 Porsche 911, the leasing company was notified of your termination at exactly 8 a.m. this morning. The vehicle was parked on Vanguard private property, which you no longer have access to. It has already been towed by the dealership." Carter's jaw literally dropped open. "Towed? I have a lease. I made the down payment." "Your corporate expense account made the down payment," Reynolds corrected him, absolutely merciless. "And that account has been permanently frozen. You are trespassing. Leave the building, or I will authorize the use of physical force and have you arrested." Sloane, who had been trailing silently behind the family like a terrified ghost, suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. The realization hit her like a freight train. She looked at Carter, her husband, the man she had married entirely for his supposed generational wealth and corporate prestige. She looked at his shaking hands, his panicked, sweaty face, and the complete absence of the sports car she loved to be seen in. Sloane didn't scream. She didn't cry. She executed a cold, terrifyingly calculated pivot. "Sloane, come on," Carter pleaded, reaching out for her hand. We have to get an Uber. We have to call my lawyer. I can fix this." Sloane pulled her hand back as if Carter were covered in toxic waste. She looked him up and down, her lip curling into a sneer of absolute, unvarnished disgust. "Call your lawyer with what money, Carter?" Sloane asked, her voice dripping with venomous clarity. "Your accounts are frozen. You don't have a job. You don't have a car. And from the sound of it, your mother is about to be completely homeless." Sloane adjusted the strap of her $30,000 Birkin bag, a bag I had technically paid for, and took a deliberate step backward. "I am going to my father's house in the Hamptons. Do not call me. My attorney will be sending the divorce papers to whatever cheap motel you end up sleeping in tonight." Without another word, without a single backward glance, Sloane turned on her heel, pushed through the revolving glass doors, flagged down a passing yellow cab, and completely vanished from Carter's life forever. Carter let out a pathetic, strangled cry, but before he could move, the security guards placed their hands firmly on his shoulders and shoved him through the doors, out into the glaring, unforgiving morning sun. Julian and Beatrice were violently pushed out right behind him. The heavy glass doors sealed shut, locking automatically with a loud, definitive click. The execution at Vanguard Holdings was complete, but the vengeance had only just begun to spread its roots. 30 minutes later, the secondary phase of the operation, the domestic liquidation, commenced. Julian, utterly destroyed and hyperventilating, had managed to scrounge a crumpled $20 bill from his jacket pocket to pay for an Uber to our supposed starter home in the suburbs. He thought he was going to a sanctuary. He thought he was going to walk into our quiet, comfortable house, collapse onto the sofa, and try to piece together the shattered fragments of his miserable existence. He was entirely wrong. When Julian's Uber pulled up to the curb, he didn't see a quiet suburban home. He saw a massive, aggressively branded commercial moving truck parked directly on our front lawn, its deep tire tracks tearing up the perfectly manicured grass. 3 burly men in matching gray uniforms were hauling heavy cardboard boxes out of the front door and aggressively throwing them into the back of the truck. Julian scrambled out of the Uber, dropping his phone onto the pavement. "Hey! Hey, stop!" he screamed, sprinting up the driveway. What are you doing? This is my house! You're robbing my house! The foreman of the moving crew, a thick-necked man with a clipboard, didn't even flinch. He stepped down from the porch and held up a massive, thick envelope bearing the official seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. "Julian Sterling?" the foreman asked, chewing loudly on a piece of gum.
"Yes, I'm Julian Sterling. Put my stuff down!"
Julian shrieked, grabbing a box out of one of the workers' hands.
"You've been officially served, pal,"
the foreman said, shoving the heavy envelope directly into Julian's chest. "Those are the divorce filings, the enforcement of your prenuptial agreement, and an emergency order of exclusive occupancy granted by a judge at 7 a.m. this morning. The property belongs entirely to your wife. You have been legally evicted from the premises. We are boxing up your personal belongings, clothing, and whatever cheap electronics you brought into the marriage. Everything else stays." Julian ripped open the envelope with trembling, chaotic hands. He stared at the thick stack of legal documents. There, in stark, undeniable black and white, was the absolute reality of his situation. The house he had lived in for 5 years, the house he had secretly used my money to maintain while lying to his mother about paying the mortgage himself, was gone.
No, no, no!
Julian whimpered, falling to his knees on the concrete driveway. He looked up at the house. The front door was open, and he could see a locksmith actively drilling out the deadbolt, permanently changing the locks. The foreman tossed a cheap plastic garbage bag full of Julian's pathetic collection of polo shirts onto the driveway, right next to Julian's knees. "Truck's loaded with the rest of your junk, buddy," the foreman said, completely devoid of empathy. "We're dropping it off at a public storage unit downtown. The first month's rent is paid. After that, it's your problem. Have a nice life." The moving truck roared to life, blasting a cloud of black diesel smoke directly into Julian's face before pulling away from the curb, leaving the weak, enabler husband kneeling on the concrete, clutching a garbage bag, entirely homeless, completely penniless, and absolutely alone. But the final, most devastating blow of the morning was reserved for the architect of my torment. The grand finale of my vengeance was dedicated entirely to Beatrice. After being violently expelled from my corporate fortress, Beatrice had demanded that Carter use his last remaining dollars to call a premium black car service to take her back to the North Shore. She needed her sprawling 6-bedroom Tudor estate. She needed her imported Italian marble floors and her antique mahogany furniture. She desperately needed the physical reinforcement of her fake wealth to convince herself that she was still a queen, that the absolute nightmare in my office was just a temporary hallucination. The black car drove down the winding coastal roads of the North Shore, passing the sprawling estates and high iron gates of the actual elite. As the vehicle turned onto the long, weeping willow-lined driveway of the Sterling estate, Beatrice closed her eyes, preparing to breathe a sigh of relief. But the sigh caught violently in her throat. The driveway was completely blocked. 3 massive, heavily armored bank liquidation vehicles were parked in a triangular formation, completely barricading the entrance to the property. Standing on the pristine, sweeping front lawn were 6 men in dark suits, 2 uniformed county sheriffs, and an aggressive, incredibly loud piece of heavy machinery. Beatrice threw the door of the black car open before it even came to a complete stop. She practically fell onto the gravel driveway, her massive designer sunglasses knocked completely askew.
"What is the meaning of this?"
Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing wildly across the sprawling manicured lawns. "Get off my property! I am calling the police! I am calling the mayor!" One of the men in dark suits, a senior asset liquidator I had personally dispatched from Vanguard's aggressive debt recovery division, turned to face her. He held a thick, leather-bound portfolio under his arm.
"Beatrice Sterling,"
the liquidator announced, his voice carrying the sharp, cold authority of the law. "You are currently 4 months delinquent on a heavily leveraged second mortgage tied directly to this property. A mortgage that was purchased by Vanguard Holdings Private Equity. You were sent 3 separate notices of default via certified mail, all of which you ignored. As of 9 a.m. this morning, the foreclosure proceedings have been violently accelerated. This property is now under the legal possession of Vanguard Holdings.
You cannot do this!
Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking, completely losing the aristocratic composure she had spent decades cultivating. She clawed at her throat, gasping for air. This is my family's legacy! You cannot throw me out into the street! I will write you a check! I will write you a check right now! Your personal checking accounts were audited at 8:15 a.m. this morning, Mrs. Sterling. The liquidator replied smoothly, looking down at his tablet. You currently possess a liquid balance of negative $412. You do not have the capital to write a check for a cup of coffee, let alone a multi-million-dollar estate. The liquidator signaled to the men standing near the heavy machinery. With a deafening, terrifying thud, a hydraulic hammer drove a massive, 6-foot-tall wooden post directly into the center of Beatrice's pristine, award-winning front lawn. 2 men stepped forward and unrolled a massive, blindingly bright yellow and red vinyl banner, securing it to the post. The sign, printed in thick, aggressive black lettering, was impossible to miss. It read, "Foreclosure. Asset seizure in progress. Property of Vanguard Holdings. Public auction pending." And then, the absolute worst-case scenario for a woman obsessed with high society optics unfolded. The heavy, rhythmic clopping of hooves and the soft hum of electric golf carts echoed down the private road. It was 10:30 a.m., the exact time that the women of the exclusive North Shore Country Club took their morning walks and drove their carts to the tennis courts. A procession of wealthy, judgmental women. The very women Beatrice had constantly lied to, bragged to, and looked down upon, slowly passed by the front gates of the Sterling estate. They stopped. They stared at the massive foreclosure sign. They stared at the armed county sheriffs, and they stared at Beatrice. They saw the untouchable Beatrice Sterling, stripped of her fake power, standing in her driveway next to a rented black car, screaming uncontrollably at a repo man. They didn't step forward to help. They didn't offer sympathy. They leaned in close to one another, whispering viciously, their eyes wide with the intoxicating thrill of witnessing the complete, public annihilation of a rival. The gossip would spread through the country club like a wildfire before lunchtime. Beatrice wasn't just losing her house. She was being permanently excommunicated from the only society she cared about. Beatrice looked at the women. She looked at the massive yellow foreclosure sign, and finally, her mind completely shattered. Her legs gave out underneath her. She collapsed onto the cold, sharp gravel of the driveway, the stones tearing into the fabric of her expensive designer coat. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, sobbing wildly, letting out a deep, guttural, animalistic wail of absolute despair that echoed into the bright blue morning sky. Back in my penthouse office, 50 miles away, I watched the final moments of the feed on my monitor. I watched the golden child standing completely alone on a city sidewalk. I watched the weak, enabling husband kneeling next to a garbage bag on a concrete driveway. And I watched the wicked matriarch sobbing in the dirt, completely destroyed by her own arrogant delusions. I reached out and pressed the power button on my desk console. The monitor went completely black. The silence in my office was beautiful. It was the sound of total, uncompromised victory. When the massive, high-definition monitor on my office wall finally faded to a cold, silent black, it took the last lingering remnants of the Sterling family's toxic grip on my psyche with it. I stood alone in the center of the sprawling executive penthouse of Vanguard Holdings. The silence in the room was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical, heavy presence. It was a thick, luxurious blanket of absolute, uncompromised peace. It was the exact sound of a 5-year psychological war concluding in total, undisputed victory. I walked slowly away from the polished obsidian desk and moved toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that comprised the entire eastern wall of my office. The Boston Harbor stretched out before me, a sparkling, endless expanse of deep, sapphire blue waters dancing under the blindingly bright morning sun. Tiny white sailboats and massive commercial freighters moved in slow, silent rhythms across the horizon. From 60 stories up, shielded by thick, acoustic-dampening glass, the chaotic, grinding machinery of the city was completely muted. Up here, in the stratosphere of true power, I was untouchable. I pressed my fingertips against the cool glass and simply closed my eyes. I took a deep, deliberate breath. I drew the crisp, climate-controlled air deep into the absolute bottom of my lungs, holding it there for a long moment, feeling the expansion of my ribs. For 5 agonizing years, I had not taken a full breath. For 5 years, I had lived in a state of constant, suffocating compression. I had deliberately shrunk my personality, dimmed my intellect, and hidden my massive success just to fit into the microscopic, pathetic box that Julian and his family had constructed for me. I had worn cheap clothes, driven a modest car, and swallowed their relentless, venomous insults, all while pretending to be a frail, unremarkable secretary who was desperately lucky to have been allowed into their decaying, fake aristocratic kingdom. As I slowly exhaled, letting the breath escape my lips in a long, shuddering sigh, the final, phantom chains of that agonizing disguise snapped and fell away into the abyss. I felt a profound, seismic shift in my own physiology. The chronic tension that had lived in my shoulders, placed there by Beatrice's withering glares and Carter's aggressive arrogance, completely dissolved. The hollow, aching anxiety in my chest, cultivated by Julian's spineless inability to defend me, evaporated like mist over the ocean. I was no longer Chloe the scapegoat. I was no longer the designated punching bag for a family of emotional vampires. I was exactly who I had always been, in the shadows. But now, the blinding light of my reality was permanently exposed. I turned away from the window and walked over to the custom brushed steel wet bar tucked into the corner of the office. I reached past the expensive imported scotch that the former CEO had favored and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water over ice. The crystal glass felt heavy and grounding in my hand. My private office phone chimed softly, a single, unobtrusive note breaking the absolute silence. I tapped the speaker button on the console. "Miss Sterling," Marcus, my chief operating officer, said. His voice was smooth, professional, but laced with a profound undercurrent of immense respect. Marcus had been with me since the very beginning, operating vanguard from the shadows while I played the dutiful wife. He knew exactly what this morning meant to me. "The lobby has been completely secured. The local authorities have been notified regarding the trespassers, and the foreclosure proceedings on the North Shore estate are officially locked into the public registry. All ties have been severed. The corporate ecosystem is entirely clean." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady, echoing with a calm, undeniable authority. "I am stepping out for the remainder of the day. Cancel my afternoon briefings. Instruct the proxy board to proceed with the European acquisitions as planned. The Empire can run itself today." "Understood, boss," Marcus said softly. "Enjoy the sunshine. You've earned it." I terminated the connection. I picked up my sleek, vintage silk clutch, the exact same clutch I had pulled that crisp $50 bill from the night before at Laura, and walked toward the frosted glass doors of my office. This was not a retreat. This was a coronation. The heavy C-suite doors parted with a soft hydraulic hiss, and I stepped out into the executive corridor. The entire floor, usually bustling with high-level analysts and senior vice presidents frantically trying to impress the shadow CEO, was dead silent. As I walked down the long, plush hallway, the senior staff stopped whatever they were doing. They stood up from their mahogany desks. They stepped out of their glass-walled conference rooms. They didn't speak. They didn't applaud. They simply watched me with expressions of sheer, unadulterated awe. Word of the bloodbath in the ground floor lobby had already rocketed through the entire 60-story building. Every single person on Vanguard's payroll now knew that the quiet, supposedly invisible woman who occasionally visited the building for clerical errands was actually the apex predator who owned the entire corporate infrastructure. I didn't break my stride. I offered a subtle, powerful nod to Marcus as I passed his corner office. He bowed his head slightly in return. The sharp, rhythmic crack, crack, crack of my Christian Louboutin stilettos echoed like a metronome of absolute dominance against the hardwood floor. I stepped into the private, high-speed executive elevator and placed my hand flat against the biometric scanner. The doors sealed shut, locking me into the sleek steel cabin as it began its rapid, completely silent plummet toward the earth. When the doors parted on the ground floor, the atmosphere in the main lobby was entirely different from the chaotic, humiliating spectacle that had unfolded an hour earlier. The massive space was immaculate, pristine, and humming with the focused, terrified energy of a corporate army that had just witnessed a public execution. The moment my red-soled shoes stepped off the elevator and onto the white Carrara marble, the ambient chatter of hundreds of employees instantly died. It was like the parting of the Red Sea. The crowd of analysts, managers, and logistics coordinators instinctively stepped back, creating a wide, unobstructed path for me right down the center of the massive lobby. I walked through the cavernous, 40-foot-high space in what felt like cinematic slow motion. I could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on me. But instead of the suffocating, judgmental weight of Beatrice's country club friends, this weight was entirely composed of fear, respect, and undeniable reverence. I looked at the exact spot near the security desk where Carter had stood, his face pale and sweating, stripped of his unearned arrogance. I looked at the exact spot where Julian had openly wept, finally realizing the magnitude of his betrayal. And I looked at the revolving glass doors, where Beatrice had been violently shoved out into the unforgiving light of reality. There were no ghosts left in this building. I had completely exorcised them. Reynolds, the massive head of security, was standing at absolute attention near the main entrance. As I approached, he reached out and manually held the heavy glass door open for me, something he had never done for the supposed golden child, Carter. "Have an excellent afternoon, Miss Sterling," Reynolds rumbled, his voice filled with genuine loyalty. "Keep the fortress secure, Reynolds," I replied, flashing him a brief, razor-sharp smile. I stepped through the doors and out onto the bustling, sun-drenched concrete of the Boston Financial District. The immediate sensory shift was intoxicating. The air smelled of salt from the nearby harbor, roasting coffee from the corner cafes, and the hot, metallic scent of the city in motion. It smelled like pure, unadulterated freedom. My private driver, David, was standing next to the armored Maybach at the curb, holding the rear door open. But I shook my head, waving him off. "Not today, David," I said, walking past the massive luxury tank. "I'm driving myself." I continued past the main entrance, rounding the corner to the private, highly secure VIP garage bay reserved exclusively for the CEO. A valet, tipped off by Reynolds' security feed, was already waiting for me. He stood next to a vehicle that Julian and his family had absolutely no idea existed. It wasn't the modest gray sedan I used to play the part of the struggling wife. Resting on the pristine, polished concrete of the private bay was a custom, completely blacked out Aston Martin DBS Superleggera. It was a masterpiece of aggressive British engineering, a low-slung, incredibly wide hypercar that looked less like a vehicle and more like a weapon designed to tear a hole through the fabric of space and time. Its sleek aerodynamic lines aggressively drank in the ambient light, and the massive carbon ceramic brakes peeked through the custom-forged wheels. The valet handed me the heavy carbon fiber key fob, his hands trembling slightly. "It's fully fueled and detailed, ma'am," he said, stepping back quickly. I pressed the unlock button. The Aston Martin chirped, its sharp LED headlights flashing like the opening eyes of a dormant beast. I opened the door and slid into the cockpit. The interior was a flawless fusion of hand-stitched Alcantara leather and exposed carbon fiber. It smelled aggressively expensive. It smelled like the kind of absolute success that doesn't need to shout to be heard. I closed the heavy door, sealing myself inside the soundproof cabin. I reached forward and pressed the glass ignition button mounted in the center console. The response was violently beautiful. The massive, twin, turbocharged V12 engine roared to life with a deafening, chest-rattling explosion of sound that violently echoed off the concrete walls of the parking garage. It was a deep, guttural, terrifying mechanical scream. The literal, auditory manifestation of all the rage, power, and suppressed ambition I had harbored over the past 5 years. I gripped the thick, leather-wrapped steering wheel, feeling the immense, trembling power of the engine vibrating through my hands, traveling up my arms, and settling deep into my chest. I pulled out of the VIP bay, the massive rear tires chirping aggressively against the pavement, and merged violently onto the busy downtown avenue. I didn't head toward the suburbs. I didn't head toward the North Shore where Beatrice was currently weeping in the dirt, surrounded by foreclosure signs. I drove straight toward the coastal highway, aiming the nose of the Aston Martin directly toward the endless, sparkling horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. As I hit the on-ramp, the city traffic completely cleared out before me. The road opened up into a sprawling, multi-lane ribbon of dark black asphalt. I pinned the accelerator pedal completely to the floor. The acceleration was absolutely blistering. The gravitational force slammed my shoulders violently back into the racing seats as the V12 engine howled, tearing through the gears with savage, unrelenting ferocity. The world outside the tinted windows instantly blurred into a streaking canvas of green trees, blue sky, and flashing highway lines. The speedometer aggressively climbed, 80, 90, 110 miles per hour. I pressed a button on the console and the heavy tinted windows rolled down. The roaring, turbulent coastal wind violently invaded the cabin. It whipped through my perfectly pinned hair, tearing the severe chignon apart, letting my hair fly completely wild and free in the slipstream. The wind felt like a baptism. It felt like it was physically, violently stripping away the last remaining microscopic particles of the Sterling family's toxicity from my skin. I looked up into the sleek carbon fiber rearview mirror. Far in the distance, shrinking rapidly against the bright blue canvas of the sky, was the Boston skyline. Somewhere in that sprawling maze of glass and steel, Julian was wandering the streets, clutching a plastic garbage bag full of cheap polo shirts, entirely alone and penniless. Somewhere to the north, Carter was desperately trying to call a wife who had already abandoned him, sitting in the lobby of a cheap motel. And somewhere, on a ruined, manicured lawn, Beatrice was surrounded by county sheriffs, permanently exiled from the fake, aristocratic society she had worshipped her entire miserable life. I kept my foot buried on the accelerator, watching the city grow smaller and smaller in the mirror. They were shrinking. They were becoming completely insignificant. The massive, terrifying monsters of my past were rapidly dissolving into nothing more than tiny, pathetic specks of dust on the horizon of my rearview mirror. And then, as I rounded a massive, sweeping curve on the coastal cliffside, the city completely vanished from sight. The mirror reflected nothing but the empty, open road behind me. They were gone. They were completely, permanently erased from my existence. I let out a sound I hadn't made in 5 years. I threw my head back against the plush leather racing seat, staring out at the endless, sparkling ocean stretching to the edge of the world. And I laughed. It wasn't a quiet, polite chuckle. It was a loud, raw, immensely powerful laugh that echoed violently over the roaring V12 engine. It was the sound of a self-made titan who had walked into the fires of a toxic family's psychological warfare, absorbed their absolute worst, and completely burned their empire to the ground from the inside out. The road ahead was wide open, bathed in the brilliant, blinding light of a flawless afternoon. I was completely unburdened. I was entirely untouchable. And for the very first time in my life, the empire I had built in the shadows was entirely mine to rule in the sun. I step into the frame. The razor-sharp white Tom Ford power suit is gone. I am wearing a simple, elegant, flowing white linen dress that catches the gentle sea breeze. My hair is completely loose, falling naturally over my shoulders. The severe, untouchable CEO mask has been completely washed away. I walk slowly toward the edge of the glass balcony, resting my hands lightly on the railing. I look out at the endless expanse of the ocean for a long, silent moment, soaking in the absolute, uncompromised serenity of a life completely reclaimed. Then, I turn. I look directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall for the final time. My expression is soft, but my eyes carry the profound, unshakable intensity of a woman who has walked through hell, conquered her demons, and returned holding the keys to the kingdom. The cinematic bass tone fades, replaced by a warm, resonant, emotionally deeply resonant acoustic melody. We need to have a very real, very honest conversation about what you just witnessed. You just watched a 5-year psychological war culminate in the absolute, total annihilation of a toxic family empire. You watched a narcissistic matriarch lose her home and her social standing. You watched an arrogant, golden child brother get permanently stripped of his unearned corporate prestige. And you watched a weak, enabling husband realize that he had sacrificed a billionaire wife just to appease a mother who never truly respected him. It is incredibly satisfying to watch. It is deeply emotionally cathartic to see the villains of the story finally reap the devastating harvest of the seeds they spent years planting. But I did not share this deeply personal, incredibly painful chapter of my life with you just to entertain you with a story of corporate revenge. I did not invite you into the darkest, most agonizing moments of my marriage just to show off a massive penthouse or a fast car. I shared this story because I know, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that there are hundreds of thousands of you watching this exact video who are currently trapped inside your own version of the Sterling family. You are sitting in the dark right now, listening to my voice, and you can feel that heavy, suffocating knot of anxiety twisting in your stomach because you recognize the exact patterns of abuse I just described. You recognize the backhanded compliments, the highly calculated public humiliations, and the relentless, exhausting financial and emotional extortion. You are the designated scapegoat. You are the workhorse. You are the quiet, reliable foundation that a deeply broken family is using to prop up their own crumbling delusions. And the reason you are still there, The reason you have not packed your bags and walked out the door is because of the greatest, most toxic lie that society has ever managed to sell us. From the very moment we are born, we are aggressively conditioned to believe in the absolute, unquestionable sanctity of family. We are told that blood is thicker than water. We are told that we must honor our parents, support our siblings, and stand by our spouses, no matter the cost to our own sanity. We are handed a cultural script that dictates we must endlessly forgive, endlessly compromise, and endlessly sacrifice ourselves on the altar of keeping the peace. But let me tell you the absolute, unvarnished truth about that script. Blood does not equal a blank check. Sharing DNA or signing a marriage certificate does not give anyone the right to treat your life, your bank account, and your emotional well-being as their personal, unlimited ATM. It does not grant them a VIP, all-access pass to disrespect your boundaries, belittle your achievements, and systematically destroy your self-worth. Think about the absolute absurdity of what we tolerate from our families. If a stranger walked up to you on the street, mocked your clothing, demanded you pay their exorbitant restaurant bill, and then insulted your career, you would immediately call the police or walk away without a second thought. If a coworker constantly belittled you in meetings while secretly taking credit for your hard work, you would report them to HR and demand a transfer. But when a mother-in-law does it, when a sibling does it, when a husband allows it to happen, we are told to smile, swallow our pride, and ask them what time we should arrive for Thanksgiving dinner. It is a form of collective psychological madness, and it only stops the exact second you decide to stop participating in the delusion. Let's talk about Beatrice for a moment. Beatrice is the ultimate archetype of the toxic matriarch. She is a woman who built her entire identity on the highly fragile foundation of how other people perceived her. She possessed absolutely no internal warmth, no genuine empathy, and no authentic self-worth. Her entire existence was a desperate, exhausting, theatrical performance designed to convince the world and herself that she was superior. People like Beatrice do not want family members. They want an audience. They want subjects. They need you to be small, pathetic, and struggling, because the only way they can feel tall is if they are actively standing on your neck. When Beatrice demanded that I pay that $3,000 bill at Laura, she wasn't actually asking for money. She was demanding my submission. She was testing the fences of my self-respect to see if I would bow to her authority. When you are dealing with a Beatrice, you cannot win by arguing. You cannot win by trying to prove your worth because they are fundamentally incapable of recognizing it. The only way you win is by removing yourself from their kingdom entirely. You win by pulling the financial and emotional rugs out from under their feet and letting gravity do the rest. Then there is Carter, the golden child, the walking, breathing manifestation of unearned privilege and weaponized incompetence. Toxic families always need a golden child to project their unfulfilled fantasies onto. Carter was allowed to fail upward his entire life. He was shielded from the consequences of his actions, bailed out of his mistakes, and praised for simply existing. But the tragedy of the golden child is that the family who supposedly loves them is actually destroying them. By constantly protecting Carter from reality, Beatrice ensured that he never developed resilience, genuine skills, or a true sense of self. When I finally fired him, when I permanently revoked his access to the Vanguard Empire, I didn't just take his job. I forced him to finally introduce himself to the real world. And as you saw, he had absolutely no idea how to survive in it. Do not ever, Envy the golden child in your toxic family. Their pedestal is entirely made of glass, and when it inevitably shatters, the fall is absolutely devastating. And finally, we have Julian, my husband, the enabler. I need you to listen to me very carefully on this point, because this is where the deepest, most profound trauma usually occurs. We often focus all of our rage on the primary abuser, the Beatrice of the family. We get so distracted by their loud, theatrical cruelty that we completely overlook the quiet, terrifying danger of the enabler. Julian didn't throw the insults at me. He didn't demand I pay the bill. But Julian's silence was infinitely more violent than Beatrice's screams. An enabler is a person who is perfectly willing to sacrifice your mental health, your financial stability, and your physical safety just to buy themselves a temporary reprieve from the abuser's wrath. Julian knew his family was bleeding us dry. He knew his mother was a monster, but he was too weak, too fundamentally cowardly to stand up to her. So, he offered me up as a human shield. He secretly drained our joint accounts, lied to my face, and begged me to just take the abuse so he wouldn't have to deal with the conflict. You cannot build a life with a human shield. You cannot build a future with someone who will drop your hand the exact second the bridge starts shaking. Cutting off the enabler is the hardest, most painful part of the healing process because they often wear the mask of a victim themselves. But you must understand, their complicity is a choice. Their silence is a weapon. And you owe them absolutely nothing. The greatest, most powerful lesson I learned from this entire 5-year ordeal, the lesson I want permanently burned into your mind as you watch this video, is that walking away is not a sign of failure. It is not an act of petty revenge. Walking away is the ultimate, apex act of self-preservation. For years, I bought into the lie that if I was just patient enough, if I was just loving enough, if I just financed enough of their fake lifestyle, they would eventually see my value. I thought my endurance would eventually be rewarded with their respect. But toxic people do not respect endurance. They exploit it. They view your patience as a weakness. They view your forgiveness as permission to strike you harder the next time. True peace, the kind of absolute, untouchable serenity that I am standing in right now, only arrived the exact second I decided to stop negotiating with emotional terrorists. It arrived the moment I realized that my net worth, my brilliant mind, and my incredibly resilient spirit were not meant to be used as life rafts for a family that was actively trying to drown me. You do not need to be a billionaire to execute a power flip. You do not need to own a private equity firm, a massive penthouse, or an Aston Martin to take your life back. Your true power does not reside in your bank account. Your true power resides in the word no. It resides in the incredibly liberating realization that you do not have to answer their phone calls. You do not have to attend their toxic holiday dinners. You do not have to co-sign their loans, fund their ridiculous lifestyles, or sit quietly at a table while they try to tear you down to their level. You have the absolute right to stand up, place your exact equivalent of that crisp $50 bill on the table, and walk out the door. You have the right to legally, financially, and emotionally sever every single tie that binds you to people who only view you as a resource. Because the moment you stop pouring your energy, your love, and your money into a black hole of toxic family dysfunction, you can finally start investing all of that massive capital into yourself. You can finally start building your own empire. I take a slow step forward, looking directly into the camera. The ocean breeze gently moves my hair. The music swells slightly, filling the space with a deeply inspiring, emotional resonance. If you are watching this video, and you are currently standing on the edge of that exact decision, I need you to know that you are not crazy. You are not selfish. You are not the villain of the story for wanting to protect your own peace. They will call you crazy. They will call you selfish. They will send their flying monkeys to guilt trip you, and they will try to publicly smear your name, just like Beatrice tried to smear mine. Let them. Let them scream into the void. A lion does not turn around when a small dog barks. You simply keep walking toward the horizon, knowing that their rage is nothing more than the desperate panic of parasites realizing the host has finally detached. I want this channel to be more than just a place where we share incredible stories of revenge and justice. I want this to be a fortress. I want this to be a massive, unbreakable global community of survivors who have looked the toxicity in the eye and said, absolutely not. I want to hear from you. I want you to scroll down to the comments right now, and I want you to tell me your story. Tell me about the exact moment the illusion shattered for you. Tell me about the day you finally realized that blood does not equal a blank check. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic mother-in-law? Have you ever had to walk away from a partner who enabled your abuse? Have you ever had to financially cut off a family that was bleeding you dry? Share your experiences. Write it all down. Because I promise you, there is someone sitting in the dark right now, reading the comments on this video, who is absolutely terrified to leave their abuser. Your story, your courage, and your specific journey to freedom might be the exact blueprint they need to finally pack their bags and reclaim their life. We heal by speaking the truth out loud. We heal by showing each other that there is a beautiful, sun-drenched life waiting for us on the other side of the exit door. If this story resonated with your soul, if you felt that deep, undeniable spark of empowerment ignite in your chest today, I need you to hit that like button, smash the subscribe button, and turn on the notification bell. By subscribing, you are not just supporting a YouTube channel, you are joining an army of fiercely independent, highly resilient people who refuse to be victims. You are joining a community that believes in holding abusers entirely accountable, setting ruthless boundaries, and building empires from the ashes of our past trauma. Do not ever apologize for your success. Do not ever shrink yourself to make mediocre people feel comfortable. And above all else, never, ever forget your absolute worth. I am Chloe. I survived the fire. I bought the building, and I evicted the demons. And I cannot wait to see you do the exact same thing in your own life. Protect your peace. Build your empire. And I will see you in the next video.